We have seen these terms before, and we've also seen something like this graph before when we talked about how a motor neuron excites a skeletal muscle fiber at the neuromuscular junction. Now, we're going to speak about these terms in application to neurons and neurons only. A skeletal muscle is kind of like a dead end. It can receive an action potential, but it can't give that action potential to another cell. Neurons, they can. So let's review. A neuron sits, or it kind of chills out at the resting potential, which we have set in this course to be at -70. That's our resting potential. It's negative because of all of those proteins that are inside of the cell. This side of the first hill on this graph represents depolarization. In this process, the cell is becoming more positive, and this results in the influx of sodium cations. So the cell gains these cations, making it more positive. Okay, so if you depolarize a membrane, you're going to have to repolarize a membrane. And this side of the hill is repolarization. In repolarization, potassium cations are moving out of the cell. So the cell is losing positives, which is one way to become more negative again. We also have a new term here, which is hyperpolarization. It is also the cell becoming more positive. It's actually this little more positive, or it could be this more positive right here. But hyperpolarization, the difference between it and depolarization. Let me start again. The difference between hyperpolarization and depolarization is defined as occurring when the cell is becoming more positive below the resting potential. So this here makes a big difference, that we're below the resting potential. Therefore, this is also attributed to the opening of potassium channels. Any and all channels we are referring to here we can assume that they're pretty much all voltage-gated channels. Those are the channels that open in action potentials. I know you're asking, Amy, but how does depolarization start if these are all voltage-gated channels? Yes, there is a little bit of depolarization associated with what's called a local potential. And it opens ligand-gated channels, but it doesn't really open up those voltage-gated channels. Local or graded potentials are only able to create very localized potentials or changes in voltage. It's kind of like a match. They fizzle out with distance from the spark, not like a fuse to TNT that is sparked and goes all the way down the fuse. These local potentials, they only open up ligand-gated channels, and therefore they can't be propagated over the axon hillock and down the axon. They get stuck at the axon hillock. These ligand-gated channels are only on the membrane where the neuron comes into contact with other neurons, which is here on these dendrites. Dendrites are full of ligand-gated channels. If we can open up enough of them with a neurotransmitter, then we're going to be able to open up voltage-gated channels on that axon hillock, and then we'll be able to propagate the electricity down the axon. So this is somewhat where the axon hillock gets its name, as hill, or an area of resistance. Postsynaptic potential is just a fancier word or abbreviation for a local or graded potential. We use this term postsynaptic potential to indicate the receptiveness of the receiving postsynaptic neuron. So it's not just a change in voltage. It's a change in voltage that can make an action potential more likely or less likely to happen. A postsynaptic potential that moves the resting potential toward threshold. That's what's happening right here. We're moving toward threshold. That would be called an excitatory post S synaptic P potential. Notice that an EPSP, it's just a little tiny small bump of depolarization. Yeah, the cell is becoming more positively charged from sodium cations moving into it. And an EPSP, it doesn't guarantee that an action potential will occur, but it makes the probability of an action potential more likely. Inhibitory postsynaptic potentials that work in exactly the opposite way. With an inhibitory postsynaptic potential, the resting potential is moved away from threshold, making an action potential less likely. So in the same way that EPSPs work, IPSPs work in just the opposite way. Sorry, that didn't come out right. IPSPs, they don't guarantee that an action potential won't happen, but they make it really harder to bring that neuron to a threshold. A neuron undergoing an IPSP will have to open more ligand-gated channels in the dendrites, a lot more, to create enough depolarization to carry the signal over the axon hillock or threshold. Most general anesthetics cause IPSP. Right? So most general anesthesias, they deaden the activities of your nervous system. They do this by opening up potassium channels, allowing potassium cations to flow out of the cell, driving the resting potential to a more negative value. This is not depolarization. It is not repolarization. This is a form of hyperpolarization. The previous slide talked about one action potential and its likelihood of happening. This is not, that's an oversimplification. This is not exactly how it happens, though, because neurons are being bombarded with neurotransmitters that are constantly opening up different ligand-gated channels on the dendrites. They're just being bombarded. There are tons of neurons that are connecting with this neuron. Tons of them, many of them. And they all don't put out the same neurotransmitter. If the presynaptic neuron sends one action potential across the synapse and then another one really, really quickly, really soon after, like fractions of a millisecond, then these two depolarizing events could sum up to create an action potential in the postsynaptic neuron. So let's do that for a minute. That's one action potential. And then there's another action potential very quickly in a span of time. So either one of these sending action potentials would not be strong enough to cause an action potential in the postsynaptic neuron. But both of these action potentials together can actually form an action potential in the postsynaptic neuron, right? So both of these together equals enough depolarization to have an action potential go over the axon hillock and go down the axon. This is called temporal summation because the postsynaptic neuron is receiving a signal at 2 points in time. And these 2 points in time are close enough to build upon each other. It is also possible for a postsynaptic neuron to receive two action potentials at the same time, but at different places on the neuron. For example, this neuron in pink over on the right, the postsynaptic neuron, It's receiving signals from the axon terminals of this purple neuron, but it's also receiving signals from the axon terminals of these other neurons that I drew here. So this pink neuron could receive an action potential here, location 1, and this pink neuron could also receive an action potential here at location 2. The sum of these two action potentials received at different locations could be enough to cause enough depolarization to get over the axon hillock and then boop, 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 travel down the axon. With both of these situations, the postsynaptic neuron needs more than one sending action potential in order for it to have its own potential. And so this is a phenomenon that is called summation. And you can have summation of action potentials at 2 points in time, but you can also have summation of action potentials at 2 locations.